Batman Arkham is a series that has undoubtedly influenced third-person action games more than any other superhero game. Spawning a number of sequels that have both surpassed and foiled fans' expectations, there's no question that Batman and superheroes in general in the video game medium have seen a new lease on life, and many would argue that this is due to the smash success of Batman Arkham Asylum. With the simplistic story of the Joker taking over a mental institution for the criminally insane, with complex narratives just under the surface, gameplay that while primitive is still as addicting as ever, and a presentation that still holds up to this day, Batman Arkham Asylum is a cornerstone in modern gaming, and its sequels have to varying degrees added to this legacy. Now, I'm sure as a majority of you have seen, I have talked about nearly every Arkham game, barring Arkham VR, which is just too short for me to really say anything on, and included in this list of Arkham games I've talked about is Arkham Asylum, which may confuse some of you. And no, I'm not running out of ideas. The reason I'm talking about this game again is simply because when I did initially talk about this game, I was very new to that style of video. And as such, the video wasn't very good. By the time I got to the other Arkham games, I had a better idea of how to make these bad boys, and while they are by no means perfect now, I think there is a noticeable quality gap between my Arkham Asylum video and the rest of my Arkham videos. Most notably is that I did more to just describe the game than I did to actually give my thoughts on it. Hence why I felt it was necessary to actually take a deeper look at it here. So with that being said, let's actually take a look at Batman Arkham Asylum, and of course, like with all my other videos, this isn't an objective statement of the game's quality, and I don't believe that my opinion is fact, and I'd like to encourage friendly discussion about the game in the comments. If you disagree with some of my points, let me know why. We could probably both learn something from it. So without further ado, let's talk about Batman Arkham Asylum. In the year of our Lord, 2007, Rocksteady presented a rhythm-based fighting game to Eidos Entertainment, who had just in the year prior acquired the rights to create a new Batman video game. Considering the reputation of previous Batman games, it's especially surprising that as far as a cast and team goes, this game had the Avengers equivalent of support, with a story written by Paul Dini and Mark Hamill as the Joker, who never fails to deliver both hilarious and slightly terrifying lines. Paul Dini took note that a lot of Batman video games mimic the stories of other media, and wanted to instead create a completely original story. The entire game was built around offering a short, concise experience that would be enjoyable for anyone regardless of their knowledge of the characters. From my experience, I think this worked, because as a little 8-year-old, this was my first real exposure to Batman. Sure, I had known about the cartoons and the character in general, but the dark tones always kind of put me off. This game, however, turned me into the Batman fan I am today, though just to be clear, Spider-Man is still #1 in my heart. And I'm sure this is true for a lot of other people, as I rarely hear people saying that they don't like this game, and the critical reception to this game was just a shower of 9 out of 10s and claims that it's the best superhero game to be released at the time. Of course, a game like this would have a darker tone, as the source material here is absolutely demonic, and it honestly gives me the creeps. It still amazes me how well they adapted the feeling and atmosphere of Arkham Asylum to this game, and how even with another 4 Arkham games, the atmosphere here is yet to be matched. This game is absolutely action-packed, and for that reason, it can sometimes be tough to actually stop, smell the roses, and really appreciate these environments, which is where I believe we should turn our gaze.
Take me on home to the asylum. Never alone in the asylum.
Every Arkham game has its strengths. Arkham City had its story and lore, Arkham Origins had its boss fights, and Arkham Knight had its refined combat and stealth, but Asylum has the atmosphere. Everything in this game has a supernatural, spiritual feel to it, from the setting itself, an asylum on an isolated island, being one of the spookiest locations to set a game in, which is just begging to be haunted. Pairing this with the villains housed here who actually do have supernatural abilities, and we get a setting that feels like it has a life of its own, and it is not happy with our presence. Something that stood out to me when I went through this game again was how aggressive and torturous it seemed. Chairs, cages, straitjackets, and large metal appendages that that resemble the arms of a spider gave me the impression that the inhabitants here may not be the true monsters that we're told that they are. I mean, why else would there be a popular suicide spot where an inmate can jump into the rocks below? There is something in the water here, and it's almost like the island itself has a mind of its own and it's fighting back. The multiple cracks in the floor and in the walls, the rusted cages, the light bulbs that look like they are minutes away from burning out, come together to give the island a level of detail that is just as otherworldly as the asylum itself. The villains also inhabit this supernatural theme as mentioned, as the likes of Killer Croc tower over Bruce, and Poison Ivy is the catalyst for the island's biggest changes, and their designs are as aggressive as the island itself. Croc's scales, glowing eyes, and beastly roars remind me of the beastly roars I let out when Harley Quinn comes on screen, who is sporting a nurse outfit this time around, and damn! You guys know it's just a joke, right? And I'm not actually attracted to a collection of pixels and polygons. Right? The island and its inhabitants look like they have been to hell and back. The work that went into creating such an aesthetic is clear in every crevice of the island, and the way it progresses over the course of the game furthers this. The progression of the island fighting back is most prevalent here. When we arrive, everything is under control. The main antagonist is restrained, and this goes for a lot of the eventual foes like Killer Croc, who literally can't touch us. Then, seemingly on a dime, Joker is able to break free and through the help of the other inmates turn the island against Batman. The hallways that are trashed and the graffitied walls are just the beginning of this chaos. When in the exterior environments, we come across guards who, while being concerned of the situation, have a confidence about them that presents them as in control. Though after some more meddling, the secured exteriors become more dangerous as the armed guards patrolling the dirt paths are replaced by crooks with snipers, wandering inmates, and eventually the crazed lunatics are thrown in there, and even Ivy's plants. By the time your conclusion draws near, the exteriors of the island are more dangerous than the interiors, which contrasts the beginning of the game. You had to work through the intensive care unit, which was filled with falling elevators, armed men, and dead bodies at every turn. Finally making it outside where you can look over one of the 3 wings of the island, it felt like you finally have room to breathe. Though hours later, because of how aggressive the outside is, you take solace in the cramped environments and low-lit shadows. Another indicator of the island's strength is the mural outside of the visitor center. The painting of the Joker becomes more and more complete as the game goes on, and I feel it represents his hold on the island, as by the time the game comes to a close, we see the completed image. It is also fitting that in the final boss fight, that same mural is on the ground, the same ground that is destroyed by the end of the fight, symbolizing Batman's reacquired control. What's spookier is the distorted chime that plays every so often as you move through the asylum, which initially features communication from Quincy Sharp, the asylum's warden, but it is eventually taken over by the Joker, using it as a way to taunt and intimidate Batman. When Joker is in control, he can inform the armed inmates of Batman's presence and uses it to spy on Batman throughout the game, leading to this feeling of being watched all the time, and that's because you are. Your every move is being picked up by the Joker and instills this feeling of isolation as if the entire rogues gallery is watching you run around like a rat in a maze. Hell, even the claustrophobic vents, which force you into a first-person perspective, feel like a maze, as there are plenty of branching paths that lead to literally nothing, and I assume they are just there to disorient you, and it will. Getting lost in the asylum is not uncommon, as the tight corridors and many winding paths allow you to be easily turned around and distracted by what's in front of you. I think what blows my mind most is how the environments here all feel a part of the same island, and yet all have unique qualities. The exterior of the island acts as an overworld of sorts, and each of the buildings are akin to dungeons in their own respect. The Metroidvania style of this game's world is easy to see, as there are portions of each dungeon that cannot be accessed without a certain gadget, and getting a new gadget incites a revisit to said location. The cutscenes here, while being unfortunately pre-rendered, still look perfectly fine and allow us to experience some of the more cinematic moments of the game, such as when gliding into the Batcave. I think what is so incredible about this cutscene is that the very gliding presented here can be pulled off in real-time gameplay within this game's sequel. The voice acting here is top-notch as well, and the ominous soundtrack is just too good and too memorable to not at least mention once. The environments themselves look great too, from the overly sanitized and locked down medical facility to the Arkham Mansion. The penitentiary houses the island's crazed lunatics, and is full of tight corridors with vents and grates for the lunatics to jump through, catching you by surprise. The many cages of this environment seem inhumane at best, and the final room where we face Harley on an electrified floor and where we see cages that seem to house Mr. Freeze make me question what in God's name is going on here. Right across is the medical facility, which sees the restraining chairs I mentioned earlier. The environments here strike a strange balance between hyper-sanitized and unkempt age. The further you descend into the medical facility, the dodgier the experiments get, as the final boss, Bane, would have you believe. Intensive Treatment is a location you'll revisit in the game, as the first time you enter, you'll only explore about half of it, but the second time around, there are a myriad of changes made to the environments you are familiar with to keep you engaged, as well as new rooms you can explore. One of which is an entrance to the sewers, which are important plot-wise, but offer some interesting gameplay changes too. When in the underground, everything is quite close to falling apart, meaning you can't just rely on your grapnel gun to carry you everywhere. Instead, you have to use your platforming abilities, which, while not very complex, are never required of you long enough for you to actually get bored with them. I just appreciated that within this section, you have to put a little more thought into your movement. The Arkham Mansion is about the most normal looking environments in the game, and even then it has this haunted house atmosphere to it. Villains' attire and gear are on display here as if they are Quincy Sharp's trophies. With each major criminal he incarcerates, he's keeping a memento of the accomplishment. The Chronicles of Arkham reinforce this pride that Sharp takes and also reinforces the supernatural themes on the island. The Victorian design of the mansion lends itself well to its atmosphere, and little details like the door being much larger than your standard door makes it feel like you are in the dead center of the uncanny valley, wandering through a liminal space. The Botanical Gardens is the final frontier of the game, and it is one of my favorites and least favorite locations at the same time. On one hand, I think the level of detail here is awesome, and it perfectly represents the themes of the island fighting back that I mentioned earlier, but I also think that aesthetically, this place is just pretty boring. This is of course just a matter of what you like and don't like, so I won't hold it to the game, and I do appreciate, however, the way the plants eventually tear apart and take over the environment. The massive vines wrap around the Arkham Mansion, and it makes quick work of the Batcave, which is surprisingly present here too. Located just off of that popular suicide point for inmates, the Batcave is pretty basic, as it's just a few tables and a computer, and it's barely present in the game. However, I do like that despite this game taking place outside of Gotham, we still get all the staples of a Batman game. While I can appreciate the detail that went into this world, and it's a large reason why the game is so replayable, you won't always be able to take note of these design details or the massive handful of Easter eggs, typically tied to riddles, because it'll be focused more on the gameplay in front of you, and unfortunately, that gameplay sometimes conditions you to look through a lens where you can't really see that detail.
Anarchy ruled, it was wild, but through it all you never smiled. Joke's on you, I'm in your head, so look who's laughing now.
The gameplay as a whole here, while ultimately primitive compared to the future entries in the series, is just as addictive here as it was over a decade ago. Coupled with expertly crafted animations that look fluid and even brutal in some cases, it's easy to immerse yourself at 9 p.m., play for 10 minutes, and check the clock to see that it's 4 a.m. I think the biggest issue with the combat here is the imprecision of it, and that is a theme that is present throughout the series. Stealth is surprisingly innovative and interesting, and everything in between, while by no means the best in the series, is a shockingly strong attempt considering it was Rocksteady's first try. The combat is boiled down to rhythm-based taps of square and triangle, and is one of the most satisfying combat systems I've ever used. It does of course get more complex with upgrades such as the special combo moves, which include the throw and the takedown. The throw is a reasonably useful tool for crowds, as if thrown in the right direction it can knock over a ton of enemies, but the takedown can completely knock out an enemy. This can be achieved by reaching a combo of 8, though with upgrades it gets lowered to 5. Pairing this with another upgrade, the critical strikes, which rewards you with twice the points a regular punch would, and you get a special takedown every 2 hits. If I glossed over this a little, it's just because I've now covered this system 3 separate times, and I don't want to bore you. I will say that once you unlock these aforementioned upgrades, which can be achieved quite early, the combat becomes brain dead easy. I do need to acknowledge, however, that despite the meme of me being awful at games being funny, I think I might just be too good for the combat. I've played through Arkham Asylum, City, Origins, and Night on so many occasions now, and I've in my eyes mastered the combat. I'm not trying to sit here and get on a high horse and act like an epic gamer, but what I'm trying to say is I don't think I can really criticize the difficulty. For example, I can complete Dark Souls 2 without dying, or without a bonfire. And is that a testament to the game's difficulty, or a testament to my 300 hours of playtime? So with that being said, I still believe that these upgrades are just busted, but I won't go any further than that. I mentioned before that the combat was a little imprecise, and when I said that, I didn't mean that I would target an enemy and Batman would go somewhere else, but rather his animation would send him somewhere else. What I mean is that his takedown animation might be at a safe distance, but the animation itself would put Batman in the path wrath of a raging titan. It was something that didn't happen too often, and it actually only happened once or twice, but it immediately gave me flashbacks to the Catwoman DLC from Arkham Knight, and I felt it was interesting to note that these problems were present in the series' infancy. Thankfully, the game very rarely puts you in a tight space, and don't get me wrong, when they do, I don't enjoy myself as much, but it was rare, and the only real time it bothered me was during the segment with the titans in the sewers. The arena was quite tight, and it really exemplified the wonky hitboxes on some attacks and the jank that can sometimes slip through the cracks here. Overall though, the game was perfectly fine as far as hitboxes and glitches go, on PC. We can talk about the remastered version of this game later. The enemy variety was recently varied here, which I enjoyed. The basic enemies go down through basic means, the cattle prod wielding enemies have to be hit from behind, and the knife enemies have to be stunned to be damaged. The biggest combat quirk that this game has that is near exclusive is the titans. These hulking masses will charge at you and do a significant amount of damage, though if there is a gap, they may throw a body at you too. On their own, these mini-boss-esque enemies are a piece of cake, but when there are enemies mixed in, it becomes a little more complicated. Now you have to juggle the charging titan with 10 other enemies trying to get a piece of you, but in this context, upon taking down one of the titan's 3 health bars, you can ride them, and it's super simple as you just steer them haphazardly with the stick, but I'd be a liar if I didn't say this was way too much fun. I like the mix-ups that these different enemies provided, and it made the combat as a whole more enjoyable. Which, while lacking the complexity of the newer games, at least has all the basics except one last thing. You can't cancel attacks. In the sequels, you'd be able to cancel a punch to do a counter, however here, you have to finish the animation before you can counter. Some would say this is a poor choice because you'd end up with a situation where you can't counter in time, and while I agree that for the conditioned player it can be a tough thing to adjust to, it made me think about who I was attacking a little bit more. For example, even before the blue lightning appears over an enemy's head, they'll move into an attacking position, and once you notice this, you can see who's going to make their next attack much sooner, and rather than wait for the counter or just start punching random thugs, you can punch the thug that is planning on attacking you. If you ignore this, you will inevitably end up in a position where you may not be able to counter in time. I enjoyed that this subtle change made a huge difference into how I saw the fight, and it made me think more and pay more attention. There is a slight issue with this though. When you do execute an attack, regardless of the timing, or so it seems, there is a variance in windup. When attacking an enemy, the punch will sometimes be lightning fast, or it'll be so slow that I wonder how it has any power at all. When making the on-the-fly decision-making that the game encourages with how you can't cancel attacks, you can find yourself getting hit purely because your animation took a strangely long time to complete. I found that this was most easily noticeable with the Joker, who, surprise by the way, is playable in the game's challenge maps, but I'll get to those later. For now, let's flip to the other side of this coin and look at how the Bat handles himself in the dark. Stealth is much like combat, primitive but addictive in the same breath, yet the replayability here is higher than it is in the combat. I think this is because stealth is much closer to a puzzle than anything else and rewards patience and forethought. While combat can be considered a puzzle, the puzzle at hand is one that requires quick thinking and quick execution. Stealth, on the other hand, will leave you spending in some cases a minute or two plotting just how you're gonna take out the room. The enjoyable part is the execution just as much as it is the planning. Making use of your gadgets to make the criminals tremble in fear is something that seems to never get old, even within future entries to the series, and that's because of another unique and well-executed mechanic here: the fear system. As the tension in the room rises, the thugs will have an increased heart rate, eventually becoming visibly shaky, and their dialogue reflects their transition from having a goal of guarding the room to having a goal that is just survive. They'll begin checking behind them frequently and checking grates too. When a body is found, the most fearful will exclaim that it's every man for himself and begin ignoring his fellow men that need his help. This system made me feel like a hunter, an eagle swooping down to catch its prey, or maybe a bat swooping down to catch its prey, I don't know. Regardless, despite being extremely outnumbered, the game gives you all the tools necessary to control the room, and making the right plays to bait an enemy into a vulnerable position is just as addictive as the combat is. An aspect I found interesting is that if the guards don't notice that someone is missing, the Joker most certainly will, and he'll alert them too. The tools mentioned earlier are your gadgets, and they can have varying degrees of usefulness, with the explosive gel and grapnel gun being the most useful and the batarangs being borderline unused throughout my playthrough. The explosive gel, which can be sprayed up to 3 different times times before being detonated, can be sprayed on a weak surface, and whatever enemy is on the other end of that surface will be knocked out once the gel is detonated. Though just the explosion alone won't knock them out, but rather knock them down briefly. The Bat Claw is pretty situational, but really satisfying to pull off. It can be used to pull objects, and in a stealth context can be used to pull enemies over a railing, causing them to non-lethally snap their necks. The line launcher can be used to boot enemies in the head, which will stun them. Not very useful in stealth, but it works for traversal. The batarangs can be used to knock down an enemy for a short time, and can be used to hit switches around the asylum as well. These were not very useful for me because whenever someone is knocked down from a batarang, anyone within a reasonable proximity will take notice and head over to help their friend, meaning that swooping in to finish the job is a tight process. If the enemy is by himself though, it's just more efficient to swoop behind him and take him down silently. The most significant tool that I've yet to bring up is detective mode, yet another facet of this game that served as an inspiration for many other games. Through the push of a button, you enter a new lens that allows you to see through walls, highlighting enemies, interactables, and points of interest. Your environments enter a simplified X-ray-esque view to better highlight the important stuff. I think that this is a really cool way to give us an advantage in stealth and equip us with the knowledge necessary to control the room, but I think the downside to this is that the player is taught in a way to heavily rely on it. Obviously, you're conditioned essentially from the get-go to spend most of your time in stealth scenarios within this mode, but you also track trails through this perspective. You have to stay in detective mode to follow the trail of Frank Bull's alcohol, and it causes you to miss out on some of the larger details within the asylum. I wonder why we couldn't just have the normal pop-ups present in detective mode, but in our real view. It could allow us to not only follow the trail, but also take in the environments. It's not just trails that require you to jump into detective mode, but also things like finding a source of power, finding interactables, and finding secrets. Even something as simple as traversing the exterior of the island requires you to somewhat depend on detective mode, as when the snipers are present, you can only see when and where they are locked onto you when you're in detective mode. I've gotten a few comments now across my Arkham videos from some of you saying that it felt like you spent most of the game in detective mode, and why wouldn't you? I think a remedy for this though would have been if they reworked detective mode entirely to be more limited. Now, I'm gonna go on a huge tangent here, but I've had this thought for a while, and this is potentially my final opportunity to indulge myself, so allow me. Imagine if rather than using an X-ray vision as a template, they base it off of sonar, you know, like a bat. Imagine when in the sonar mode, you can see the world through the sound bouncing off of the surrounding environments, akin to how it was portrayed in The Dark Knight. You could pick up on subtle sounds such as enemy footsteps, but your footsteps would be too loud and cause your vision to be distorted. This would force you to only enter this mode when stationary, preventing the player from relying on it and giving you a greater reason to use the vantage points in stealth, and also allow you to take in the environments more. Of course, on top of the gadgets and abilities I listed, there are a number of upgrades to go along with them, which can be purchased through your acquired Wayne Tech points, which are earned from doing just about anything. The combat upgrades mentioned earlier were referred to as busted, but I don't think this applies to the upgrades for stealth and gadgets. The first stealth upgrade you should invest into is the inverted takedown, where upon perched atop a gargoyle, you can hang upside down and lower down to grab a thug and hang him from the gargoyle. The imagery alone of a shadowy figure stalking these guys looking like Dracula is so creepy, but in the best way possible. That is unfortunately the only upgrade for stealth, which is a little disappointing, but we can at least upgrade our gadgets. For example, we can, instead of throwing one batarang, throw two and even three eventually, which is like, whatever, man. I think it's cool, but it was so situational that I don't even remember the last time I used them outside of getting footage for this video. I mean, you can use them to knock down groups of enemies, swooping down to take one out, but in almost every stealth scenario, there is one or two thugs that are completely separated from whatever duo is on the map. The explosive gel can receive an upgrade where you can detonate the gels individually rather than the default, which detonates them all one after another, and a further one that causes it to detonate when an enemy is within its radius. The Sonic Batarang has a heartbeat monitor decoy on it that will attract a nearby guard. Pretty useful if an enemy is in a tricky spot, but not much else. That is if you don't upgrade it one more time, which allows it to take down an enemy. And if you think that this might be a little overpowered, fear not. These upgrades, or at least most of them, have a cooldown. So yes, you could just spam the Sonic Batarangs to take out a room without being seen, but it would take a hell of a long time. Outside of stealth, there are the basic upgrades like extra health, extra power and range on the cryptographic sequencer, and a remote control control Batarang, which while an interesting idea, I saw very little use for. The upgrades here, as mentioned earlier, are not that deep, and I wish there was a little bit more, especially in the stealth department. I think it could have been interesting to allow us to use the cryptographic sequencer to deactivate an inmate's heartbeat monitor, allowing us to take him out without anyone hearing about it. I am somewhat torn though, because the main campaign will take you no more than 8 hours, so perhaps I'm asking too much from such a small game. Fortunately, there is one mix-up with stealth where you have to enter a room and sneak past a handful of inmates before you can take them out, and I really like that Rocksteady not only gave us some variation, but only did it once as to not make this type of stealth annoying. Another one-and-done concept they used was strapping bombs to the gargoyles, which was equally interesting. If you are wanting to attempt some of the early game scenarios with late game upgrades, then you can tackle the challenge maps. I've never really touched on the challenge maps in any of my Arkham videos, simply because they never really grabbed me for very long outside of the trophies tied to them. I'd much rather just replay the game and experience these set pieces within the context of the story. Regardless, I can at least commend the sizable amount of challenge maps here that feature some of the best set pieces from the campaign, and they have challenges associated with them tied to your score and how you take down your foes. Some of the harder combat challenges can be really tough to get 3 stars on, and it's great, except the way you unlock them definitely isn't. You can unlock these bad boys by completing some of the 240 Riddler challenges, and I also haven't talked much about this in my other Arkham videos. Anywho, there are hundreds of these trophies, destructible teeth, riddles, interviews, and chronicles of Arkham hidden around the map, and some of them are tied to the challenge maps. The game does throw you a bone by telling you which specific challenge contains a reward, but sometimes that reward is a challenge or a character trophy. I guess they have to incentivize you to collect these things somehow, and to be fair, the Riddler challenge that unlocks a challenge map is typically close to that location within the asylum, meaning you'll have around half of them if you grab any that are directly in your way. And truth be told, I know some people get annoyed about the Riddler trophies, and I can understand why. It's tedious as hell, and I would have liked the option to ignore it. Keeping things like the Chronicles of Arkham and the interview tapes under the umbrella of Riddler challenges turns collecting the other challenges and subsequently the other collectibles into a chore, when in reality these interview tapes and chronicles are interesting enough to be collected on their own. Specifically, those tapes and chronicles were a ton of fun to listen to. There are a number of these interview tapes around the island which compile the interviews of the villains and the psychiatrists at Arkham, and they give you a greater idea of the inmate's mindset, which were spooky to say the least.
Can you make me normal? Normal is a poor choice of words. No one's really normal, are they?
Figured as much. So, how about this, Doc? You let me go now, and I won't eat you.
You don't really eat people. It's just an urban myth.
Oh, you think? Keep believing that, Doc.
Regardless, these collectibles were pretty interesting, but their tandem to the Riddler challenges and challenge maps made them a little more tedious than I had hoped. Something I mentioned about the challenge maps was that on both the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, you can play as the Joker, which was a really awesome decision, and it's just another reason why I grew up as a PlayStation fanboy. Joker controls the exact same, and the animations combat-wise are the only real distinction when it comes to combat, though it's enough of a distinction to make it pretty fun. In Stealth, he has a more limited but still enjoyable moveset consisting of some chattering teeth, which upon detonation will kill a guard, a gun, like that's it, it's just a gun, and his spectacles that act as a stationary detective mode. His takedowns are pretty fun, but there isn't too much here that separates him from the dark and brooding counterpart, and that's fine in my eyes. Now, you may have also noticed I'm playing the original release of Arkham Asylum, which I'm doing on PC, instead of the remaster on the PlayStation 4. The reason for that is because I just don't think the remaster looks all that good. Sure, the lighting in the game looks great, but the 30 FPS capped frame rate and the touch-ups made to the many faces look a little off. The color correction is also just not very pleasant to look at in some cases, and considering that the Game of the Year edition is cheaper, I think it's really a no-brainer. And I think this goes for Arkham City too. Outside of the challenge maps are the equally enjoyable individual levels and segments within the game, such as the boss fights.
I've waited a long time for this, Bats. Let's start the party with a bang.
The first to cover is against a Titan. I don't think this counts as a boss fight, but I wanted to bring up the fact that this scenario does a fantastic job of teaching the player how to properly deal with these enemies in an open and controlled environment, without any variables. Bane ends up being the more advanced Titan, and his fight is quite intuitive. His moveset is nearly the exact same as a Titan's, except now the aforementioned variables are taken into account. There's now a huge amount of enemies that swarm you, and this fight teaches you how to deal with the Titans while also avoiding the enemies, which will be useful since this enemy composition will reappear in many different forms throughout your playthrough. The Scarecrow nightmares are easily the most unique parts of this game, as they see you in a psychedelic stealth section where the tables are turned and you are the prey, in stark contrast to the typical Predator scenarios. In here, Scarecrow shoots a deadly gaze across the map, and merely being spotted results in death. These end up serving as a bit of a side-scrolling segment, and the visuals alone make this enjoyable, but mechanically they make use of some newly acquired gadgets too. There were some mix-ups here, such as where you have to fight some enemies while staying out of Scarecrow's gaze, though his sightline rarely shifts, meaning you could just bait the enemies away from the light. Eventually, in the final battle against Crane, you fight some more enemies, and this time there is a Titan enemy thrown in. These guys went down right after dodging them, and it made it pretty easy, and in all honesty, pretty lame. I think this could have been done better if the Titans took more time to go down. For example, perhaps the Titans can only be destroyed by pulling their spine out of their backs with the bat claw after they are stunned. This could flip the typical way that we deal with Titans on its head. The usual strategy sees you focusing on the Titan, as when their health bar is down, you can hop on top of them and thin out the large number of goons that are typically surrounding them. However, here, hypothetically, taking out their spines would function the same as pulling the grate out of a vent, and trying to do that while a bunch of other enemies are on you is going to be really difficult, so dealing with the enemies first would be most optimal. Something I praised earlier was how the first Titan you face shows you how to defeat Bane later on. Well, if we were to have this spine-pulling idea, it would give the player some familiarity when defeating the final boss, who also goes down from a bat claw to the back. I would have also liked to see a stealth scenario where you have to defeat some enemies in a room while having to move around Scarecrow's rotating gaze, though I think my wishes may be too ambitious here. Overall, these nightmares took the unsettling atmosphere of Arkham Asylum and turned it into flat-out horror in possibly the most memorable way they could, and it served as some of my favorite moments of the game, with each encounter getting crazier and crazier. The first just sees you with mild hallucinations, and the final sees a fake crash, a roll reversed intro, a middle stick, and a fake game over screen. I'd go on, but it's better to just experience these for yourself, and a lot of others already talked about how great these are. The next is Killer Croc, which is less of a fight and more of a game of cat and mouse, or I guess croc and bat. You enter the enclosed sewers to grab a particular spore, used in curing those injected with the Titan serum. You have to cross a pathway floating on the water, but as you move, the ripples in the water will let Killer Croc know where you are, and he'll attempt to ambush you every now and then. You actually can't damage or defeat Croc, but rather you have to activate his shock collar to prevent him from sinking his teeth into you. I love the atmosphere in this fight, and I really like the intersections within this literal maze, as when you hear that terrifying music that plays when Croc begins his assault, you have to rapidly check around to see where he is, and the panic is just beautiful to play through. The many groans and dialogue lines add to this, but it's not the only tool up Croc's sleeve, as he'll begin destroying the walkways and you'll have to run away from it. I felt that this wasn't very challenging, but because of how the encounter was executed, there is still an element of anxiety as you sneak through the sewer system. The penultimate boss fight is against Poison Ivy and her kaiju plant. However, I found this fight quite boring, despite its interesting design and scale. It sees her in a giant plant with two vines acting as arms, which can set traps on the floor, summon some brainwash guards, and shoot some, pollen thing at you. If caught in the trap, it'll do some significant damage, and trying to defeat the enemies while avoiding said traps can be tricky. Eventually, she changes her stance and starts shooting more projectiles at you. The way you defeat Ivy is by throwing batarangs at her. Since dodging the projectiles is as simple as double tapping X, you can just evade, batarang, rinse and repeat until she goes back to her previous stance. It made the boss fight pretty mechanically boring in my eyes, and because of that, it was a little forgettable. The final fight is against the Joker. Just you, him, and oh yeah, he took the Titan formula, so he's a hulking beast, and he's been a heavy point of criticism for years now. I said this before and I'll say it again, I don't really get the hate here. A lot of people criticize the design of Joker and the idea of a roid rage clown, and while I agree it's a far out idea, I think it fits perfectly fine within the plot. Regardless, I believe that the fight itself mechanically is the real issue. So let's go back to what I enjoyed about Bane for a second. I enjoyed that he is the culmination of the Titan battles, except now with Bane there are some enemies which act as added variables. So once you know how to fight Bane, you know how to fight the Titans. So with the Joker fight, you just fight enemies head on, then fight the Joker, then enemies, and so on. It's a literal step back, as not only do you not actively fight back against him, but you fight the variables on your own, boiling the fight down to just running in a circle, fighting not even a large amount of goons, and then using the Batclaw. It doesn't feel at all like a natural progression of the mechanics or even a final exam of your knowledge culminating in a single scenario. What if instead we had a moment where we're in a tight space with the hulking Joker akin to the Bane fight in Origins, where we have to use our explosive gel to bring the walls down on him, pull boxes down on him with the Batclaw, and so on. Imagine further if they took the safety net away from you, detective mode. You could find whatever reason to get rid of it, be it a jammer or whatever, but taking away detective mode would put the player in a greater sense of danger. They'd have to use the sound of Joker's massive footsteps and as many taunts to get an idea of where he is. It would take a game that consistently walks the line between thriller and horror and send it over the deep end. As you finish that stealth boss fight, you could transition into a second phase where you can face off against a weakened Titan Joker, and it could function similarly to the other Titan fights. It would also work thematically, as the gameplay of Arkham typically sees Batman in the position of predator, and the boss fights typically see him in the position of prey, so being able to get both of these in one fight would satisfy that. Just to clarify, I'm also not a game designer, so please take what I say with a huge grain of salt. I don't think that Rocksteady is just sitting in their office with a big red button labeled Fun Boss Fight that they can just press whenever. Overall though, the boss fights were a lot of fun, and much like many of the other aspects of this game, it is primitive and it is outshined by the rest of the series. But that doesn't stop it from being fun in its own right and standing on its own amongst the quadrilogy. Another aspect in which this game stands apart is in the game's spirit. This is a strange thing to nail down, but it's the culmination of the budget, the design, the environments, and nearly everything else under the narrative that make you feel like you are playing a passion project. That maybe didn't have the best graphics or even the best gameplay, but I'll be damned if this game didn't have the heart.
We'd be together. Look who's laughing now. I'm stuck in your head and I'm laughing. I fill you with dread and I can't stop laughing.
The spirit of this game is present in every nook and cranny, as is the spirit of Arkham. The plot on the surface is simple, and it really is, but the lore expands much further than the plot, which is why I enjoy it. The story of Arkham Asylum on this particular night is what's on front display, but just beneath it is the history of Arkham, and that's why despite the story being short and simple at a surface level, it's still enjoyable, as it feels like it's taking place in a pre-established world. The plot begins on this same sentiment, as there is no exposition, context, or even a title card, with the closest we get to a title card is the camera panning up at the top of the gates, which read Arkham Asylum. All we know is that Batman has yet again captured Joker, quite easily this time too, and he's taking him to Arkham Asylum, a clash of modern technology and historic medicine, only for the Clown Prince of Crime to break out in an awfully convenient fashion. Upon chasing him down, we see that this has been a plan long in the making, and that things like Batman not being allowed further into the intensive treatment and the temporary transfer of Blackgate prisoners to the island was all part of Joker's master plan. And while the logistics of this plan are not entirely explained on the surface, they don't really need to be in my eyes. We track down Joker and see a new hulking mass similar to Bane that is most certainly right-handed. Joker of course escapes, and while we have our hands full, Commissioner Gordon is kidnapped by Frank Bowles, another cog in Joker's machine. We track him down, and when we do, we have a run-in with Bane, who refers to Dr. Young, a previously rescued doctor, as Bruja, which translates to witch. This causes us to look into Dr. Young a little bit more, and we find out that she was working on a formula for a new strain of Titan, and the person funding it is Jack White, one of Joker's many pseudonyms. Dr. Young became wary of the experiments of which she performed on Bane, and this caused Joker to initiate his plan to take over the island, finish the tests himself, and create an army of Titans. As we work through the mansion to find Dr. Young, we see her taken hostage by Victor Zsasz, and she dies right before we can get much out of her. But through a gloating Harley Quinn, we know where to find more info. After tracking her down and defeating her, we're given the next step, which is to head to the Botanical Gardens to potentially find a cure to the Titan Serum, as we see that the Joker has put it in Gotham's water supply. We head to Ivy and she tells us that the only spore capable of being used in the cure is in Killer Croc's lair. We grab that and return to Ivy, defeat her, and confront Joker. After explaining that his entire night has essentially been foiled by Batman, he injects himself with the Titan formula, and we get that all too infamous boss fight culminating in Batman spraying explosive gel on his hand, allowing him to throw an explosive punch to Joker's face, and that's about it. Now I have to mention again that the Titan Joker didn't bother me much. Some have argued that it clashes tonally with the rest of the game, but I don't really see it that way. The game has hulking monsters all throughout it, and a basic one-on-one fight against regular old Joker wouldn't satisfy the logical conclusion of all the Titan formula nonsense. I also think that's just as crazy as a comic book conclusion should be, and for myself, it was important to remember that this game was heavily inspired by said comic books, and this is reflected in the game's expertly crafted UI. It wasn't until Arkham City and most notably in Arkham Knight that the games really started to feel less like comic book games and more like Arkham games. The progression of the story itself felt natural, and while it seemed like the game suffered from feeling like a wild goose chase in retrospect, in gameplay it felt perfectly fine, aside from the portion where the game makes you return to the Arkham Mansion just to talk to Cash before entering the sewers. I felt that this was a point where the progression stumbled a bit, though I think it was done to allow you to see the effects that the plants have on the island. As funny enough, right after Batman tells Ivy not to do anything, she starts going batshit crazy on the island, and her plants destroyed just about every inch of it, even the Batcave. I think the reason a story as simple as this works is because while it may be quite short and straightforward, it's dense. You hear a lot of people criticizing AAA games such as Assassin's Creed for being a mile wide but an inch deep, and I feel that a game like Arkham Asylum is the antithesis of that when it comes to its narrative. There are literally hundreds of collectibles that reference characters within the universe and give you extended backstories on said characters. Finding audio tapes for Victor Zsasz makes him all the more terrifying, as he slowly turns the tides of these patient interviews, becoming the one who controls the conversation and even plots to kill the very doctor trying to treat him. Scanning riddles for the radio, which plays voice lines from Jack Ryder, a prominent reporter in Batman comics, is so unnecessary, but it's a fine detail that just sweetens the world. Other little details like the gas present before you enter a scarecrow sequence that upon walking into them will cause Batman to cough, walking into the visiting room after each encounter and seeing what the Joker has to say about all of it. Hell, you can, through spraying explosive gel on seemingly random walls within the warden's office, find a hidden room with the proposal of Arkham City, which is easily my favorite Easter egg in the game. There are hundreds of secrets here that expand the world, and covering these little details will take ages, so I'll stop myself here. The most notable audio tapes you can find are not quite audio tapes, but are chronicles that, when deciphered, share the story of Amadeus Arkham, the asylum's founder, who is long dead by the time the story occurs. Amadeus Arkham, son of the dementia-ridden Elizabeth Arkham, watched his mother struggle with mental health, and it drove him to a career in psychiatry. One of his former patients, by the name of Mad Dog, killed Arkham's wife and daughter, with the daughter having the name Mad Dog carved into her chest. Arkham then opened the Elizabeth Arkham Asylum and personally treated Mad Dog, but after 6 months of treatment and seeing no improvements, he killed him, framing it as an accident, and this served as a catalyst into his nosedive into the very madness he spent his life trying to destroy. He eventually felt it was his duty to cleanse Gotham of the madness it seemed to so easily breed, and eventually he became a patient at his own asylum. Now, the Chronicles of Arkham are quite strange to decipher because despite Amadeus being dead, there are a number of chronicles that are in parts of the asylum built after his death. I initially thought this was an oversight, but it's actually due to the revelation that occurs as you further scan the chronicles. Some of the audio logs begin describing someone who delivers patients to the island. Some of the new guests are Killer Croc, Poison Ivy, and even the Joker. The revelation is that Quincy Sharp experiences a split personality disorder and begins seeing himself as the Spirit of Arkham. Believing that the Spirit of Arkham was talking to him, he began stalking his patients and killing them. In some of the chronicles, we can see points where Sharp is watching Harley Quinn being seduced by the Joker. Planning then to kill the Joker, it seems Sharp had a slight change of heart and just couldn't go through with it. It's all very confusing, but really interesting. I think what is most interesting about the Spirit of Arkham is that it's less of the actual spirit of Amadeus Arkham, but more his mindset and ideology that affects people. When Sharp felt that the patients should be killed to cleanse Gotham, that was the Spirit of Arkham. You could say that the Spirit of Arkham is present within Hugo Strange, who also wanted his legacy to be the ultimate destruction of Gotham's criminals. The Arkham Knight has the same ideology that at some point you just have to kill those who are incurable. The Spirit of Arkham is the ideological opposite of Batman, and the game doesn't necessarily come to a conclusion on which ideology is correct, but leaves enough food for thought to satisfy me. I think that the culmination of this game's gameplay, story, and most importantly, its atmosphere, is a product that is far greater than the sum of its parts. It wasn't perfect for sure, but I think it says a lot about a game when even after 3 sequels and years of improvements, it can still stand on its own and is enjoyable outside of those sequels. It is a representation of the game's foundation and the series' roots, but it also proves that the gameplay of the Arkham series is something that is enjoyable at its core. Its combat is simple in its execution and mechanics, but regardless, it entertains for the full runtime and even some challenge maps. The stealth shares this sentiment too. There's only one stealth upgrade here, but the foundation they set of being able to pick away at a room as the tension rises is so fun that the core mechanics didn't need any changes in the sequels. Only more bells and whistles. The story was simple for sure, but future games were able to provide more expansive plots with the same amount of passion put into them, and even more collectibles for better or worse. I think one thing that was never nailed quite the same in future entries was the atmosphere. And to be fair, that's because I and a lot of others would say that they near perfected it here. And rather than bring that same horror-like aesthetic, they took a different direction, with varying results. I think that the atmosphere is the biggest reason why Arkham Asylum is still worth playing or replaying today. On top of that, the game is fortunately small enough that it seems just about everything is so tightly knit, and that's something future games could not achieve to the same extent, as the sequels brought more ambitious narratives and mechanics that inevitably led to greater flaws, but with the silver lining of having greater strengths, leaving Arkham Asylum ultimately the smallest and least ambitious of the quadrilogy, and yet the most consistent in the series. It only makes sense that a game like this be compared to other video games even to this day, as it served as such an influence on gaming as a whole. Arkham Asylum laid the groundwork for one of the most popular and arguably best AAA series as of making this video, with fans still wanting more. And that's why I believe it is an isolated, expertly crafted, nostalgic, horrifying masterpiece.
There's nothing like a comeback, is there, Matt? Let's go again.
Howdy, partners. It is the end of the video. It's 2 a.m. as I'm recording this. I actually rendered the video, but then I realized I forgot to do the outro. So here we are. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry this took so long. I'm going to keep it 100% with you guys. I've had a rough, last 2 weeks. I've had some personal stuff that I've been sorting out on top of, a slight move. And for some reason, I just haven't been sleeping well. And so, that all kind of culminated in, I'm putting a lot of time into it, but I'm not working as efficiently as I typically am. So that's why this video took a while. The Sleeping Dogs video will come next. Pretty much no matter what. So yeah, if you notice I didn't use any of this game's soundtrack, it is because it is all copyrighted and I would have gotten claimed, and I like money. And speaking of money, I'd like to give a shout out to our gold tier patrons: Bossian, Christopher Moreno, Mario Nade, Mark Short, Predica, and Pyrite. Our silver tier patrons: Chiefy, Dr. Nannard, Gonzo Gonzalez, and Jacob Douglas. And finally, the bronze boys. We have Denzel Ritesh, Nathan Figs, Overza East, and Ulf Hedenar 845. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I do appreciate it. As far as next videos go, I'm going to try and have the next one out in another 2 or 3 weeks. And then we'll see how everything goes from there. Follow my Twitter if you guys haven't already. Don't worry, it's not some weird... It's not like other Twitters where I think about something and immediately tweet it. I'm really good about looking at a tweet and being is this cringe? Is this a really shitty take? And do people actually give a fuck about this? And then I'm really good about not hitting send if it doesn't check those boxes. Or if it does check those boxes. Pretty much the Twitter is only for video stuff or promoting things that I'm in, and the occasional question/update. And then I also have my streaming channel. I'm trying to stream more, but I'm gonna keep it 100% with you. I just don't get the same passion from streaming that I once did. And so I don't know how consistently I stream over there, but it's more the second channel's there if you want it. Yeah, and that's why you should follow my Twitter as well, because on my Twitter, I let you know when I am streaming. I have a Discord server that there will be a link to in the description. Feel free to check that out, take a look at it, do whatever. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I appreciate you guys for sticking around for so long. I love you guys. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe. Stay healthy. See you later.